deformed body, unbearable agony, a stench so overwhelming that courtiers fainted in his presence. When Henry VIII died, his coffin began to leak a foul liquid, and in the dead of night at the abbey, stray dogs lapped up the fluids from the rotting King of England. This was not merely death, it was the ultimate humiliation, a grotesque ending forever tied to the name of Henry Tudor, once hailed as the most handsome, athletic, and majestic prince in all of Europe. Picture this: a king who once claimed power equal to God himself, a ruler who condemned wives, friends, and loyal men to the scaffold, now lying helpless, destroyed by his own decaying body. No more glory, no more majesty, only the unbearable stench of a corpse, spreading through the royal corridors like a curse. The story of Henry VIII's death is more than a historical horror. It is a cold reminder that no matter how much power you wield, no matter how many thrones you claim or how many lives you end, you cannot escape the decay of the flesh. And so, tonight, we peel back the layers of darkness surrounding Henry's life, from the radiant young prince to the grotesque cadaver disgraced by stray dogs. This is a tale few dare to tell, but today you will hear it in full. Before his body became a grotesque ruin, Henry VIII was admired as one of the most dazzling princes in Europe. Born on the 28th of June in 1491, he grew up in the Tudor court as the second son of Henry VII. Because his older brother Arthur was destined to inherit the throne, the young Henry was not raised under the crushing weight of kingship. Instead, he was allowed to flourish in the arts, sports, and studies, and he developed into a man of extraordinary talents. As a boy and young man, Henry was described as tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome. His red gold hair shone in the sunlight, his complexion was fair and clear, and his bearing was regal. A Venetian ambassador once declared that Henry possessed an angelic face and a body more admirable than any Christian prince. In the eyes of Europe, he was the very image of vigor and beauty. Henry excelled in physical pursuits. He was a fearless rider, often galloping at full speed in the lists, and his skill in jousting became legendary. In hunting, archery, and wrestling, he outperformed many of his noble companions. At tournaments, the crowds roared when Henry appeared, both for his athletic ability and for the magnetic presence he radiated. But Henry was more than a sportsman. He was deeply cultivated. Fluent in Latin and French, and with knowledge of Italian and Spanish, he conversed easily with scholars and diplomats. He composed poetry, played several musical instruments, and even wrote and arranged songs. His love for music was so great that foreign visitors often compared his court to that of Renaissance Italy. To them, Henry seemed as much an artist as a ruler. His appetite for knowledge extended to theology and philosophy. He spent hours debating questions of faith and governance, always eager to prove his intellect. In these early years, he was considered a true Renaissance prince, a ruler who embodied both physical power and intellectual refinement. Henry's charisma was equally undeniable. He was known to laugh heartily, to dance with elegance, and to converse with warmth. He could win over both nobles and commoners with ease, a skill that strengthened his popularity and his image as a natural-born king. When he ascended the throne at the age of 17, following the sudden death of his brother Arthur and his father, Europe watched with anticipation. Here was a monarch, young, strong, and radiant, seemingly destined to usher England into a golden age. The first years of his reign confirmed this promise. He held splendid tournaments, dazzled foreign ambassadors, and projected the image of a kingdom full of youth and vigor. In portraits from this era, Henry is shown with a lean, athletic body, standing tall in glittering armor or rich robes. He embodied the optimism of a dynasty that had only recently secured the English throne. To his subjects and to outsiders, he seemed invincible. No one in those years could have imagined that this shining figure would one day be transformed into a monster of flesh and pain. The same man who was praised as the handsomest prince in Christendom would, in time, be remembered as a bloated tyrant, reeking of decay. His glorious youth made his later downfall all the more tragic. The story of Henry VIII is therefore not just one of power and cruelty. It is a tale of extremes, the dazzling light of early promise and the suffocating darkness of his end. And to understand the horror of his death, one must first grasp the magnificence of his beginning. The glorious image of Henry VIII began to crack in January of 1536. At 44 years old, he took part in a jousting tournament at Greenwich, still eager to prove his strength despite his growing age. The king thundered across the lists in armor that gleamed beneath the winter Sunday. Then disaster struck. His horse stumbled and fell, crushing Henry beneath its weight. The impact was devastating. Henry was left unconscious for 2 long hours, and courtiers whispered that England might already be without a king. When he finally stirred, relief spread through the crowd. But the truth was far darker. His right leg had been severely injured. Though physicians managed to save his life, the wound never fully healed. What began as a deep bruise soon turned into an ulcer, an open sore that refused to close. Infection took root. The leg swelled, festered, and oozed. From that day forward, the king carried with him a permanent reminder of his vulnerability. For a man so vain, so attached to his image of strength and beauty, the injury was a cruel humiliation. The physical pain was constant, but the shame may have cut even deeper. Courtiers could smell the king before they saw him, the fetid odor of the ulcer announcing his presence. No one dared flinch or cover their nose, for to display disgust before Henry was to invite his wrath. His vanity, once a source of charm, curdled into paranoia. Some historians suggest the accident caused more than a leg wound. They argue that Henry may have suffered a traumatic brain injury when his head struck the ground. The evidence lies in his sudden change of character. Before, he had been exuberant, charming, even generous. After the fall, he became suspicious, quick to anger, and merciless. Within months, he ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, on charges widely recognized as fabricated. It is possible that the accident unleashed a darkness already brewing within him. The physical consequences also altered his body. Restricted in movement, Henry began to put on weight. The once athletic frame thickened. His waistline expanded from 90 centimeters to more than 130. Soon, he weighed over 180 kilograms. His body had to be hoisted by mechanical pulleys between chambers, and even the palace doorways were widened to accommodate his girth. The prince who once embodied vigor was now becoming a prisoner inside his own flesh. Diet only worsened the decline. Records from the royal kitchens revealed that Henry consumed about 5,000 calories a day, mostly from red meat and rich pies, washed down with oceans of ale and wine. Vegetables were rare on his plate. Combined with his forced inactivity, this diet accelerated his deterioration. The ulcer, meanwhile, grew worse. Physicians, lacking modern knowledge, treated it with brutal methods, cauterizing with red-hot irons, applying salves laced with mercury and arsenic, and bleeding him regularly. None of it helped. The flesh rotted further, the stench intensified, and bones sometimes showed through the wound. What had begun as a single accident became the turning point of Henry's life. The radiant prince of Europe was gone. In his place stood a man in constant agony, humiliated by his body and increasingly cruel to those around him. From this moment forward, every aspect of his reign would be overshadowed by suffering. The fall at Greenwich did not simply break his leg, it shattered the illusion of invincibility, setting him on the path toward the grotesque death that would horrify the world. The accident at Greenwich marked the beginning of Henry VIII's irreversible decline, but the following years revealed the true scale of his deterioration. By his late 40s, the once magnificent king had transformed into a figure both grotesque and pitiable. His weight ballooned uncontrollably. Contemporary records suggest his waistline expanded beyond 130 centimeters, and his overall weight exceeded 180 kilograms. This was not just obesity, it was a collapse of the body that left the monarch unable to walk unaided. Specially designed chairs and pulley systems were required to move him from chamber to chamber. In a palace once filled with the thunder of his athletic jousts, the king was now reduced to being hoisted like a burden. His immense size reshaped the physical environment around him. Doorways in the royal palaces had to be widened to accommodate his frame. Furniture was reinforced to bear his weight. Even his armor, once a symbol of knightly glory, became little more than a museum piece, relics of a past self that no longer existed. The cause of this rapid decline was not only his injury, but also his indulgent diet. Henry's meals were extravagant feasts, recorded in meticulous detail by the royal kitchens. On a typical day, he consumed roasted beef, lamb, venison, swan, and even porpoise. He devoured pies stuffed with meat and suet, washed down with gallons of ale and wine. Vegetables were scarce, often dismissed as food for peasants. It is estimated that he consumed close to 5,000 calories per day, an astonishing intake for a man whose physical activity had become severely limited. This imbalance fueled a vicious cycle. The less he moved, the more weight he gained. The heavier he became, the harder it was to move at all. What had once been a life of vibrant activity had collapsed into a prison of flesh. The ulcers on his legs, first born from the jousting accident, worsened with each passing year. Infections spread deep into the tissue, and physicians, bound by the medical practices of the time, applied treatments that only made matters worse. They cauterized the wounds with red-hot irons. They smeared on ointments laced with mercury and arsenic. They drained his blood, weakening him further. None of it healed the king. Instead, the ulcers grew so severe that bones were visible beneath the decaying flesh. The stench became legendary. Accounts from the period claim that Henry's presence could be detected 3 rooms away. Courtiers were forced to endure the odor in silence, for to cover their noses or flinch would be seen as an insult to the king. Many dabbed handkerchiefs with perfumes and pressed them discreetly to their faces, but the foulness of the air was impossible to mask. The once glorious court of England became a place of miasma and whispers. For Henry himself, the suffering was relentless. The pain in his legs left him sleepless, irritable, and often raging at those around him. His pride was shattered by his inability to move freely. The man who had once embodied vitality was now a swollen shadow of his former self. This grotesque decline was not just physical, it corroded his authority as well. A king who had once dazzled with athleticism and charm now inspired fear through sickness and decay. His body had become a symbol of his tyranny, bloated, rotting, and oppressive. The decline of Henry VIII's body was not merely a private tragedy. It was a spectacle that defined his court, a daily reminder that even a king who once seemed invincible could be consumed by his own flesh, and as his body fell into ruin, so too did his reign begin to darken. If Henry VIII's body had become a prison, his mind soon turned into a battlefield. The once vibrant king, who had charmed Europe with his charisma, now descended into paranoia and cruelty. The wounds of his flesh seemed to infect his soul, corroding the last traces of compassion. His temper, already fierce, became volcanic. He flew into rages at the slightest provocation, condemning courtiers, ministers, and even close friends to execution. To serve Henry in these years was to live in constant fear, for his moods were unpredictable and his wrath lethal. The fall at Greenwich had left more than a leg injury. Many historians believe he suffered a brain injury, explaining the sudden transformation from a generous prince into a tyrant. Symptoms of traumatic brain damage, impulsivity, aggression, mood swings echo through the chronicles of his reign. His paranoia grew especially acute regarding betrayal. He became convinced that conspiracies surrounded him on all sides. Wives were not spared. Anne Boleyn, his second queen, was accused of adultery and incest in charges widely regarded as fabricated. She was beheaded in the Tower of London in 1536. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, met a similar fate in 1542, executed for alleged infidelity. Whether guilty or innocent mattered little. The suspicion itself was enough to seal a death sentence. Even his most trusted advisers were not safe. Thomas More, once his close confidant, was executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his religious reforms, was likewise sent to the block when he fell out of favour. Henry's court became a revolving door of power and death, where loyalty offered no guarantee of survival. The ulcerated leg, the obesity, and the ceaseless pain fed into this paranoia. Sleepless nights left him irritable and unstable. The stench of his own body was a constant humiliation, reminding him that even a king was subject to decay. In his fury, he projected his torment outward, lashing at those who surrounded him. Foreign ambassadors recorded with horror the changes in his demeanour. Where once they had met a king eager to impress with wit and charm, they now encountered a swollen tyrant, quick to shout, quicker to threaten, and entirely unpredictable. One ambassador wrote that all live in dread of the king's fury, for his suspicion is as boundless as his corpulence. Religion, too, became entangled in his inner torment. Having broken with Rome, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Yet his conscience was never at peace. He veered between embracing Protestant reforms and clinging to Catholic traditions, executing subjects on both sides when they displeased him. His faith, once a source of pride, became another arena of conflict and bloodshed. Perhaps the most chilling transformation was in his capacity for love. The young prince who once composed poetry and played music for his beloved now seemed incapable of affection. Marriages became political contracts or tests of loyalty rather than unions of the heart. His suspicion poisoned intimacy, leaving him isolated even in the presence of queens. The torments of Henry's mind did not simply shape his personal life, they altered the fate of England. His paranoia drove policies, his rages decided executions, and his fears carved the future of church and crown alike. What began as a wound on the body had metastasized into a sickness of the spirit. The radiant monarch of Europe had become a tyrant, haunted by shadows, trapped in a body of decay and a mind at war with itself. In Henry VIII, the line between man and monster began to blur. The court of Henry VIII, once a dazzling theatre of music, feasts and tournaments, slowly transformed into a palace of fear. The splendid halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, adorned with tapestries and filled with courtiers, became a stage where suspicion reigned supreme, and silence was the currency of survival. Every man and woman at court lived under the shadow of the king's wrath. A careless word, an unguarded glance, even a pause too long before answering the monarch could spell disaster. Those who once competed for the king's favor with wit and talent now fought simply to remain unnoticed. In Henry's later years, survival was not achieved by brilliance but by invisibility. Executions became an almost routine part of court life. Nobles who had served faithfully for decades suddenly found themselves accused of treason or heresy. The Tower of London, that grim fortress by the Thames, filled with prisoners who had only yesterday walked the halls of power. The axe of the executioner was polished with dreadful regularity. Henry's paranoia about betrayal created an atmosphere where trust evaporated. Friends spied on friends, servants whispered against masters, and even family bonds offered no shield. Fathers testified against sons, wives against husbands, all hoping to save themselves from suspicion. The court became not a community, but a collection of trembling individuals, each one fearing that tomorrow would bring their downfall. The machinery of death extended to the highest nobility. The Duke of Buckingham, one of the wealthiest men in England, was executed on charges so flimsy they shocked even his enemies. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a celebrated poet and soldier, was sent to the block only 9 days before Henry himself died. The message was unmistakable. No one, however noble or talented, was beyond the king's reach. The fear seeped even into banquets and ceremonies. Courtiers sat stiffly, forcing smiles while the smell of the king's ulcerated legs filled the air. Perfume-soaked cloths were discreetly pressed to noses, not only to block the stench but to mask the terror that gripped every heart. The king's jokes were met with nervous laughter, his questions with rehearsed flattery. Behind every bow and curtsy lay the same desperate hope to survive another day. Foreign diplomats observed the chilling transformation. Once welcomed into a glittering Renaissance court, they now reported a place of dread, where every gesture was calculated and every word weighed with mortal caution. An ambassador from Venice wrote that, "The court of England is less a palace than a prison, where all tremble before their master." The terror reached even the royal family. Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, learned to mask their thoughts, to speak carefully, to bow deeply. Each knew how fragile their lives were in the presence of a father who could, at any moment, see treason in their eyes. Catherine Parr, his last wife, narrowly escaped execution herself, saved only by her quick wit and timely submission when Henry's suspicion turned toward her. This climate of fear reshaped English politics. Ministers made decisions not by what was best for the realm, but by what would appease the king's volatile mood. Policies shifted erratically, not guided by reason but by paranoia. England itself became hostage to the caprices of a suffering monarch. Thus, Henry's court, once a beacon of Renaissance splendor, became a symbol of tyranny. It was a place where loyalty could not guarantee safety, where brilliance brought risk, and where the most powerful men and women lived like prisoners of their own fear. The legacy of these years was not only blood on the scaffold, but a kingdom scarred by the terror of its king. By the time Henry VIII entered the final chapter of his life, the bright promise of his youth was long gone. His body was swollen and foul, his temper unstable, and his reputation drenched in blood. Yet, even in this state, the king sought companionship, power, and the illusion of renewal through marriage. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was barely 19 when she wed the nearly 50-year-old monarch. To Henry, the match symbolized a return to youth, a desperate attempt to deny the decay of his own body. For a time, he showered her with gifts and attention, calling her his rose without a thorn. But the reality of the union was grotesque. Catherine, vibrant and young, recoiled from the obese, ulcer-ridden king. She found comfort instead in the arms of Thomas Culpeper, a courtier closer to her own age. When the affair was exposed, Henry's wrath was merciless. Catherine Howard and Culpeper were executed in 1542. The execution of his teenage queen shocked Europe and deepened the aura of terror surrounding the English court. For Henry, it was another wound to his already tormented soul, a reminder that no love, genuine or forced, could soften the horrors of his decline. His sixth and final marriage was to Catherine Parr in 1543. Unlike Catherine Howard, Parr was no naive girl. She was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply religious. Her role was less that of a wife and more that of a caretaker. She dressed his wounds, managed his household, and soothed his volatile temper with patience. In many ways, she became less a queen and more a nurse, tending to a monarch who was already half dead while still alive. Yet even Catherine Parr nearly lost her life. When Henry suspected her of harboring Protestant sympathies, enemies at court sought to turn his paranoia against her. A warrant for her arrest was prepared. Only Parr's quick wit and her strategic submission saved her. She flattered Henry, insisting that she only discussed religion to distract him from his pain. The king relented, and the warrant was quietly withdrawn. Meanwhile, Henry's health plummeted. He could barely walk without mechanical assistance. His legs, rotting with gangrene, emitted a stench so strong it was said one could detect his presence from 3 rooms away. Fevers racked his body, while his weight exceeded 400 pounds. His face, once admired as angelic, had become bloated and cruel. The once mighty king now lived in cycles of agony and paranoia. He screamed at servants, cursed his doctors, and drifted into bouts of melancholy, whispering the names of his dead wives, Jane Seymour most often, but sometimes Anne Boleyn as well. To those around him, it seemed that ghosts haunted his bedchamber, tormenting him with reminders of his sins. At court, no one dared mention death, for to predict the monarch's end was treason. Yet everyone smelled it literally. The odour of decay hung in the air long before January of 1547, when Henry finally succumbed. His last gesture, unable to speak, was to squeeze the hand of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, affirming his Christian faith. The marriages of Henry's final years, far from bringing joy or stability, only underscored the grotesque contrast between the ideal prince he once was and the broken tyrant he had become. The love he sought in Catherine Howard turned to betrayal and blood. The loyalty he demanded from Catherine Parr reduced her to the role of nurse and survivor. Together, these last unions reflected not renewal but ruin, the inevitable unraveling of a king who had once believed himself invincible. In January of 1547, the reign of Henry VIII staggered to its gruesome end. The once glorious monarch, who had reshaped England with blood and iron, lay confined to his chamber at Whitehall Palace. His body was a ruin swollen with disease, riddled with ulcers, and consumed by infection. By then, Henry weighed more than 400 pounds. He could no longer rise from bed without mechanical assistance. His legs were bloated, gangrenous, and leaking pus. Courtiers described the air around him as nearly unbreathable, so heavy was the stench of decay. Even the bravest physicians recoiled from the task of tending his wounds. As his final days approached, silence gripped the court. It was treason to predict the king's death, yet everyone could see it coming. The once mighty tyrant now drifted in and out of fevered dreams, whispering prayers, curses, and the names of his long-dead wives. At times he seemed to see them at his bedside, as if the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had come to drag him into eternity. On the night of January 27th, unable to speak, Henry summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. The king clasped the archbishop's hand in a final gesture of faith, too weak for words. Moments later, his laboured breathing ceased. The most infamous monarch in English history was dead. But death did not bring dignity. In keeping with his stature, Henry's corpse was placed in a massive coffin, lead-lined to contain the stench. Even so, his grotesque bulk proved difficult to control. During the journey to Windsor, the coffin began to leak fluids of decomposition. Chroniclers record that the remains burst through the coffin lid while resting overnight at Sion Abbey. According to legend, stray dogs were found licking at the vile leakage, a horrifying symbol of divine justice. The funeral was immense, meant to display grandeur despite the grim reality. Nobles in black processed behind the colossal coffin, while mourners recited prayers for his soul. Yet for many, grief was mixed with relief. The tyrant was gone, and England could breathe again. Still, the burial site was telling. Henry was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, in the same vault as his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour, the only queen he seemed to truly love. But the tomb itself was never finished. Unlike the grand monuments of other rulers, Henry's final resting place remained stark, incomplete, almost neglected. For a king who demanded glory in life, death left him with an unfinished grave, as though history itself denied him closure. What lingered was not majesty but horror. His reign had seen executions by the hundreds, 6 marriages, religious upheaval, and a transformation of England's destiny. Yet his body's decay mirrored the decay of his soul. In the end, the illusion of invincibility rotted away, leaving only a monstrous reminder of mortality. Henry VIII, once the radiant prince of Europe, ended not in splendor but in stench, his corpse, splitting open, his memory forever bound to blood and ruin. His death was not just the end of a king, but the grotesque climax of a life lived in excess, cruelty, and self-destruction. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 did not simply close the life of a single man. It marked the end of an era, and it left behind a legacy both transformative and terrifying. His reign had reshaped England forever, yet his personal downfall mirrored the dangers of unchecked power. Politically, Henry's greatest act was severing England from the authority of the Pope in Rome. By establishing the Church of England under his own supremacy, he laid the foundations of English Protestantism and permanently altered the religious landscape of Europe. What began as a desperate quest for a male heir turned into a seismic shift that still defines Britain today. The crown, once bound to the Catholic Church, became its own sovereign power. This single act would echo through centuries, fueling conflict, reform, and empire. Dynastically, Henry's obsession with securing his bloodline proved tragically ironic. His only legitimate son, Edward VI, ruled for a mere 6 years before dying at the age of 15. His daughter Mary, remembered as Bloody Mary, attempted to reverse his reforms through violent persecution, but her reign was short-lived. It was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry, executed, who would ascend to the throne and usher in England's golden age. In the end, the king's legacy came not from the son he sacrificed so much to produce, but from the daughter of the woman he condemned. Culturally, Henry transformed the monarchy itself. No longer merely the first servant of the realm, the king became the embodiment of the state. His word was law, his will absolute. But this absolute power consumed him. What began with charm and vitality ended in paranoia, tyranny, and physical collapse. His body, bloated and rotting, became the perfect metaphor for a reign corrupted by excess and cruelty. Historians still debate Henry's character. Some see him as a bold reformer who carved England's independence from Rome. Others see only the despot who executed wives, friends, and subjects without remorse. Perhaps both are true. He was a Renaissance prince turned medieval tyrant, a man of dazzling talent undone by his own appetites. In the end, Henry's story is not just history, it is a cautionary tale. His life reveals how ambition can ignite greatness, but also how pride, indulgence, and fear can corrode even the strongest of men. His corpse, bursting from its coffin, symbolizes the futility of power against mortality. The paradox is striking. Henry VIII, who believed himself God's anointed ruler, died like any other man, his flesh decaying, his body leaking, his legacy uncertain, yet his shadow still looms. The Anglican Church, the Tudor myth, and the image of the swollen tyrant all remain woven into the fabric of English identity. 4.5 centuries later, his reign continues to fascinate and horrify. He reminds us that no throne, no crown, no power is immune to time. In life, he sought to control church, state, and destiny itself. In death, he became the ultimate lesson that all kings, no matter how mighty, are prisoners of the flesh. Henry VIII's true legacy is not only the England he created, but the warning he left behind, that unchecked power rots the body, corrupts the soul, and dies in disgrace. His story is the eternal reminder that even the greatest rulers cannot escape the equalizing hand of death.